Good evening and welcome to the Alfa Romeo Museum and a new episode of our Backstage series, just like last week when we talked about a very special person, a big father of Alfa Romeo, Gobato. Today we are going to talk about another father of Alfa Romeo, Giuseppe Busso. And in 2023, uh, we celebrate the anniversary of his birth. Giuseppe Busso is a person who's very talked about when and quoted when we talk about Alfa Romeo, but also a very complex person. Despite other people who work at managerial level in this company, left his mark not only in what he did, but also in what he said, or better, what he wrote. He left a series of very important notes. Some of these have been published uh, in the different conferences that he held and in his book and in many other occasions. Sometimes the notes were corrected, amended, because one of the characteristics of Giuseppe Busso was of having kind of an edgy character. And even if you didn't know him personally, you can see this from what he writes. And from this information, we can reconstruct several pages of the history of Alfa Romeo. But before getting to the heart of our conference, I want to leave the floor to one of his arms who left us not long ago, who very briefly speaks about his collaboration with Giuseppe Busso at the moment of the launch of his book in 2005, so the presentation that was held here in Arese at the Direction Center Auditorium. So please allow me to say that Mr. Busso every day took note of what happened day by day, and these notebooks were very useful to then write this book. From the technical point of view, I would like to say that Mr. Busso was a lover of sports cars. I am less so. I preferred more the production cars, even though I worked on the famous 12 cylinders and on other cars that went on the racetrack. But my main interest was to fine tune the technical part and design part of the production cars. So starting from the 1900, no, not even, from the Giulietta, then Giulia, and then the most beautiful to me, the Alfetta. I used the Alfetta, well, an Alfa 90 up to 1999. So it was a car which had 15 years. It was a pre-series, so the body of the car was not beautiful, but it was extremely rewarding driving it. And talk about some essential points, I'd like to give you a few bullet points, critical points. One of the most important projects for me was the Giulietta one. The architecture of the Giulietta was so cutting edge that up to the end of Alfa Romeo 87, the engine of the Giulietta, of course, with modifications, etc., but remained the backbone of all the production cars of Alfa Romeo. So, the 2000 is a direct son of the engine of the Giulietta. The other engine that I liked very much was the 6 cylinders V6, which still today is produced, even though modified with a stronger horsepower, etc. But the basic concept of this engine was excellent because as of today it is still produced. Other engines were produced for more sports cars, but these were not production car engines, so their production was limited, while the engine of the Giulietta and the six cylinders had an incredible success all over the world. So, this is what I wanted to say. And Busso's career was not a solo career. On the contrary, it was a career in a team which was very strong and was led by Orazio Satta. And they originated an endless series of projects, many of which we are also driving, and some others were not so successful. But all this is told very, very specifically by Giuseppe Busso, who always puts a date, a name in a very precise way to the stories and never hesitates to talk about his team, his esteem for Satta, his esteem for some of the great people who are for Alfa Romeo Gobato, who hired in 1938, and also Gobato, with whom he worked in the post-war period. And this team already was a team when they studied at university, because these characters who started to work for Alfa Romeo around Second World War are those who would originate this company. So you know that today we didn't put the Alfetta or Alfa 6 in our room, but other cars, just like La Matta, to which he devotes an entire chapter of his book, The Engine of the Small 103, even though it would never become a production car, but it talks about an excellency period of Alfa Romeo. Alfa Romeo, for example, would arrive very late to the front wheel drive. When Busso was hired in 1938, he starts working the years of the war, also in Lago d'Orta. Then his career stopped. He worked for other companies, just like Ferrari, to name one. And then at the end of the 40s, he would come back to Alfa Romeo, and he started to have more and more important roles until he became deputy director of Alfa Romeo in 1972, almost at the end of his career. So his recognition would only be not ours, of the fans and of the company who would make him grow in his career, but also a recognition coming from the outside, because the talent he had, the capacity of giving life to many cars, and especially many Alfa Romeo, which to us are much more than cars, because they tell a story of interpreting the car in order for it to be an Alfa Romeo. And the career of Giuseppe Busso, of course, crosses the path of many other characters. And he always lauded the technicians or managers who had great respect for the technical part, and sometimes he had more stronger comments for characters like Vittorio Iano and others, pre-war design school that Busso didn't agree with, because he thought it was empirical. He was more attracted to the English school like Riccardo, who to him was the best in terms of engines of Fredo Ricard. Well, there were many, many opinions, which allows to understand how the history of Alfa Romeo didn't go through a straight line, but through a series of ideas, rethinkings, fights. So all the discussions which are necessary to give life to an excellence. And among these documents that partly are in the documentation center of Alfa Romeo, as we will discover soon, there are other exhibits, like for example the menu of the dinner when Nino Farina's victory of the World Championship was celebrated. We can recognize some of the signatures, and there are many, many people who now are painted on the walls of the museum because they were the protagonists of the history of Alfa Romeo. We saw her in the video a little bit. We talked about the documentation center, so I would like to ask Elvira Ruocco to come on stage with me. Elvira, it is always a pleasure to meet with you. Please take a seat. Well, I met Mr. Busso at the end of 1984 here at the museum. And to celebrate that day, I have to make a step backwards a few months before. I worked at the press department of the company, so distribution inside the company. So Franco Perugia one day called me and he asked me to lead the documentation center, which had been there since 1969, but according to him, never worked well. So the most important thing I had to do, apart from putting order to it, was to bring to the archive, to the office, a rich and varied documentation that was in the basement of the museum, coming from different centers of the and departments of Alfa Romeo. And one afternoon, because in the morning I did press review, and in the afternoon I worked at the archive. I was with Mr. Bonini. It was a test pilot. Then he became sports director of the Portello racing team, and also worked for the Italian registry. And sometimes he came with me, he helped me to bring up folders. I asked him for indications about names, and we met Mr. Busto. I never saw him before. Well, I know his name and his fame, but I never met him before. So I was introduced to him, and when I told him what I was doing, he told me, well, nice to know, I will come and see you. And he came there. And when he came there, he asked me a $1 million question. I still remember it. He asked me, lady, miss, would you be able to find a report on the flight test on the R121 engine? Because I have to verify the differences between the engine produced during Second World War and the one produced in the post-war period. And I was startled. I said, well, Mr. Busso, I never saw anything about flight engines, that a folder with pictures, but if I find something, I will call you immediately. And I found that thing, and that is one of the most interesting funds of the historical archives, because it's the aviation fund, and we discovered that treasure together, because at the back of this great room I saw a very thick plastic leaf. I lifted it and said, oh, this is what Mr. Busso was looking for. I asked him to come. He arrived there after a couple of days, and together, almost kneeling down, we lifted that plastic leaf together, and we worked together to see the folders. And then we brought the folders to the office, and he started to come to my office. So I freed a desk for him. So he checked all these folders. And in the end, he also found the report that he needed. And then he started to come regularly every Wednesday. And after that, we chatted a little bit, so our friendship started with high esteem and affection. I'm sure he also was very close to me, because he found someone who listened to. I like to listen to the elderly people from Alfa. And when we met Mr. Moroni and him, it was a pleasure to listen to them. And then I also took down notes. And talk about notebooks, Busso oftentimes had a notebook. He had one per year of work, even when he was in Ferrari. Yet sometimes even just a word sparkled the memory in him. There was no need to write an entire sentence. So he told me about characters and episodes of his life. As you said, he held in high esteem Mr. Satta, and often he recalled that Satta and his team, so Busso, Colucci, Nicolis, Garcea, and Sanesi, well, I said these men and their collaborators are the true strength of Alfa Romeo. And he was proud of saying so. And then sometimes he also talked about some episodes that were not so positive. For example, the fact of not being able to replace Satta. So Satta went away before the retirement in 77. And another sorrow, the biggest one, I think, was when he had to give to Kitty the 33, the running prototype, because Loraghi wanted. So there's a picture in the archive which witnesses this historical shift. So you see Kitty from the window observing the car that in the picture is in the front stage with Salvo Sanesi, and Mr. Busso is standing with a very sad attitude. And then something he was also sad about was not graduating, but I know that Andrea Vecchi and other people from Alpha clubs did a lot to try and get the graduation certificate, but then Busso probably, when he disappeared, when he died, this could not be possible. And in the morning of January the 3rd, 2006, I received the sad news that Mr. Busso left us during the night. So I saw him 1 week before. I often went. I was not working anymore, but I was in contact with even a phone contact sometimes. So in the end, the conversation always ended with this question: "Well, will you call me?" or I will call you. I said, I will call you, Mr. Busso, but if you need something, you can call me anytime. So, in that morning, I could never think it would be the last time I spoke with him, and I came back from a tour organized by the Alfa Romeo former workers, and I had a high fever, so I could not go to the celebrations, but I went back to his house a few weeks after the celebration of his death, because his son asked me to organize the papers of and documents of his father, and that was a great emotion. So imagine sitting at his desk and seeing his entire life pass through my hands. So I worked a lot on that, and I created a fund, the Giuseppe Busso Fund, who now is in the hands of the heirs. And I would like to conclude, Lorenzo, by saying something that gave a lot of joy to Mr. Busso, I think. And it was the presentation of his book, which Andrea Vecchio organized in the auditorium of the center of Alfa Romeo. And it was an incredible emotion, not only for Busso and his family, but everyone who participated was really emotional. And I can say that I was the one to trigger Mr. Busso to write something. He was not very willing to do that. He said, I'm old, and I said, oh, you have to do it. You know how I convinced him? I said, you have to do this for Alpha fans, because they love you. They know that we are in contact, and they asked me to bring you greetings. And then they call it the Busso engine, not the 6 cylinders. And you don't want to leave anything to these people? So in the end, he smiled at me and he said, okay, but if you help me. And I helped him. So I received a copy of the book by Busso with a quote which always makes me emotional when I read it, and I often read that book and held my book in my hands. To my dear Villaruoco, that with her heart, passion, and affection made my dream come true. With the esteem of all the Bussos, Arese 2005. Thank you. Well, you anticipated most part of the questions I had, but all the notes, well, part of the notes were then donated to the documentation center thanks to your work. Yes, yes. I sent them to Pasquale Oliveri and another collection. These were mainly German books on Porsche, on Mercedes, on things that he studied. I sent them to Isa to the attention of Mr. Boscarelli, of course, always with the authorization of Fiorenzo, because I said, Fiorenzo, here there are several copies, and he said, you do what you think it's best. And it was beautiful. It was a great experience. I just finished my work at Alpha, so getting back to handling those documents, which were my passion, so this is the truth. I did this with all my heart for him because I was very affectionate to him, not only to him, to all my elderly people, Giambattista Guidotti. I have so many histories about him and also some fun anecdotes. And also engineer Kiriko. I also convinced him to write the book because he was writing articles. So I said, why don't you put all these articles together? And then we created a book that you know on all the Alpha models, and then Moroni, of course. I see Morone's son here. I also was very close to Moroni. You know why, Lorenzo? Because I listened to them. Even when we were having lunch, I said, Mr. Moroni, can you tell me that episode? Moroni was not one who talked a lot about the past, said past is past, also about the future, but Bonini was there. Can I say one last thing? Bonini lost, and I'm very sad about this. He lost the turtle that D'Annunzio gave his father, Pietro Bonini. So he knew German, he was a friend of Caracciola. Caracciola also put him in his testament, so talk about Nuvolari, said, I have it here, I will bring it tomorrow. But he didn't think that that brooch didn't have a block like this one, but just a pin. So we talked about that all day long. In the evening, he went to a car dealer, and the next day, he said, Elvira, I lost the brooch. And I said, oh, it's my fault. And he said, I don't find it anymore. I lost it, and I feel guilty for this. Well, and those notes go from 1986 up to the end of the 90s. So when did you convince him to write the book? Well, it was a couple of years before the book was published. April 2005. So since he didn't come here anymore because he was not feeling super well, so I called him and I also went to see him. He had two helpers, home helpers, which are very nice. So sometimes it was lunchtime and I smelled the soup. And he said, I have to go because lunch is ready. And he got emotional. And I want to say the last thing. For the book, he made me a present. So before going on that small trip, this helper, who was from Chile, I think, let me in. I saw Mr. Busso, who was seated, and he had a folder, or a package, and I thought it was for me. And I brought him, the panettone and a bottle of wine, and said, well, this is for you. I think it's good for you, and it's a Limoges coffee pot. So he could not go out, but he asked them to buy that thing. So I'm romantic. I'm sensitive to these things. I like history. I like to listen to history and to tell history because we need to convey these messages because otherwise uh, you leave the world and the nice thing is to share everything, not to keep things for you. And thinking about fans, well, this backstage is always done in collaboration with the club, and this time it was the Alpha Club Milano, so I would ask Andrea Vecchi to join us on stage and to take the floor, because he also wants to tell something, not about Busso's history, because Busso's history is the history of Alfa Romeo in the post-war period, but how the character of Busso is considered today and valued today. Hello, everybody. As Lorenzo said, I focused more on the affections, on how we lived Busso. But before starting, I wanted to show you what I call the first melody of Giuseppe Busso. We are in the heart of Alfa Romeo, in these walls, and these walls heard a lot of times that melody. This is the Alfa Romeo twin shaft, the most used engine, produced from 1954 with Giulietta until 1998 with the 164 when it was retired. 10 years ago, we celebrated the 100th year of the birth of Giuseppe Busso, and we wanted to do that in what was at the time still the mechanics pavilion, even though it was empty. And during that event, many people participated, and many of them today are no longer there. So it's nice to listen to what they said about Giuseppe Busso. Fiorenzo Busso is arriving. So the Portello was about to become a grape factory. It was a great satisfaction also for Busso, who saw the entire world looking at this new feat. A few years later, though, he was sad because he was not involved in the development of Alfa Sud and about the front wheel traction, the front wheel drive. But his passion for Alfa prevailed because he also wanted to complete the project of the Alfetta, presented in 1972, his last project, which gathered recognition of journalists all over the world. Busso recalls that occasion as a happy day when he so recognized the love that he spent for 25 years in that company. a difficult character, charismatic, a lover of doing and redoing, also creator of dreams. Orazio and Giuseppe were at the basis of the great success of the products that they produced. So they go from the 50s till the death of Orazio in 74, and then Giuseppe Busso's when he retired in 77. Busso has all the professional and human virtues. He was a complete man. The presence of Busso and the presence of the teachings that come from Alfa Romeo technique, from the sports tradition of Alfa Romeo, from the truth to the cultural values of Alfa Romeo. I arrived in 55 and Alfa Romeo was already living, healthy, and developing. So he did a few rare conferences in which he conveyed not only passion, but also the characters of his personality, determining in his pupils the ambition to be like him and like Alfa. So I think that Giuseppe Busso taught us not to give in to difficulties. He always was very strong. At the time that Alfetta 2000 was considered the best, but Busso, I think, wants to teach us to persevere. Well, this man was Giuseppe Busso. Before going on, I'd like to open a couple of brackets about why it is called V6 Busso. Busso did practically the entire production of Alfa Romeo and Alfa Nord from the post-war till the last production of the V6. At the top you see all the twin shafts on which Orazio Sattapuliga, under the direction of Giuseppe Busso, worked. So from the 4 cylinders to twin shaft to 1900, the Matta 2000, 4 cylinders with a pig iron base, the twin shaft, which is identical but with 6 cylinders at 2600, the 8 cylinders twin shaft of the 33 Stradale and Montreal, and of course the 6 cylinders 2500, which among all of these, even though it was made under the direction of Giuseppe Busso, is the one that less represents him because it's not a twin shaft. This was designed by Edo Mazzoni, who's here, well, whose son is here, Marco Vinicio Mazzoni. Here he is. And it was drawn by one of his closest collaborators, Edo Mazzoni. So these are the cars that they created. Why do we talk about perseverance, commitment, even though there were difficulties? Because he wanted to build something extraordinary. In the Alfetta, it is the best possible representation of technology, so all Alfa Romeo's experiences are condensed in the Alfetta. So why I always say he wanted to humble and humiliate the competitors. Giulia was already better than the other ones, the German one. They could not have the same drivability and power of a Giulia. With the Alfetta, they wanted to exaggerate the Dion bridge at the back, distribution of weights, all on a car that today could be defined as a super sporty Gran Turismo. Today, cars with the front engine and a back shift, well, Maserati, Porsche Panamera, not many others that I can think of. In order to do this, he got inspiration, he drew inspiration from a Formula One car, the 159, the Alfetta 159, which won in 1951 the Formula One championship. But why he put the Didion bridge? Not only for that. This is a note of Giuseppe Busso and an anecdote. The reason why he wanted to put the Didion on a family car like the Alfetta is that when I go around the museum, sometimes I stand still in religious silence in front of, for example, the Scarabeo from 1966 on the small 103. But the object to which it is difficult to deny love is the Sportiva di Bertone 2000 from 1954. Why does Busso say so? Well, in one of his many writings, he says, it was a new car to talk about. It was March 1967, a new Giulia, when Satta oftentimes said he was not happy because we were not involved in the Alpha suit for the new car. We had freedom for the mechanics apart from the engine, which would have continued to become the old 4 cylinders of 1954. It was 67, and for him the 4 cylinders was already old. About 1,800 horsepower. The back suspension was chosen during a memorable test drive in June 67 in the hill area near the Passo della Futa. So 2 GTAs with 8 cylinders engine were tested with independent suspensions. The sports one with the Didion, which was lying in the deposit for more than 10 years. So we put new tires, and in these tests between Pian del Voglio and Fiorenzuola, the old elderly car was the best one. That's why the Didion was chosen for the Alfetta. And I want to continue with the writing from Giuseppe Busso talking about the Alfetta. The prototype of 116 started in 68 with the Didion, It looked like a Giulia, and then about over 1,750. When the first Alfa Sud engine was seeing the light. So in October the same year, the Naples car would see the light. You see, he always compares the design of Alfa Sud. It's a healthy competition, I think, which pushes every designer to be better than the other one. So October of the same year for the Naples car. At the end of 69, there was a difficult period which would last years and would impact in a not positive way the work of everyone. It talks about the trade union fights of 1969. So there were strikes with violence, and still in 1973, the situation was similar. So the managers had to meet outside of the company, and it was not nice to me to recall that Sata was forced to leave the office. It was November 1970. It was the 18th day. The Alfetta was presented in Balocco to the president and the other managers of the company. And everybody was enthusiastic about it, but 1 year later, when production had to start, we had a lot of troubles with the mechanics and with the body, vibrations, noise. It was crazy. Satta told me that only in two other occasions, the time of the Romeo's diesel and when the body of some cars broke a few years ago, well, this never happened. So Satta was very tense, just like all the other team members. So it was very difficult, almost impossible to talk about production. Wait. And at the famous press conference of November 71 in Turin, the president could only talk about Alfa Sud because the 116 was far from being ready. May 17th, 1972. So presentation of the Alfetta, which was presented to the press, the international press, in Grignano, in the province of Trieste. Enrico Sala was the commercial director. Satta and me were very serious. We didn't want to show the preoccupation. We had lunch with the president, and after a few months, I gave to Satta the scheme of an Alfetta with a front shift. But I didn't want to give in, so it was a scheme of an Alfetta with a front shift. What is he talking about? He's saying that the Alfetta had been presented, so he's talking about what he would always call the Alfettina, so the new Giulietta, the 116. See, this is the press presentation of the Alfetta. See, to the left, we see Manuel Fangio to communicate that it was a Formula One car. See Moroni with a Formula One car. Here is Grignano near Trieste. We see Orazio Satapuliga, Enrico Sala, Guido Moroni, Manuel Fangio, Enrico Sala, and the President Luraghi. This is the famous terrace of the Adriatico Hotel. Now there will be a pilgrimage to that hotel, which is still there in Grignano, and this is the Alfetta. I met Mr. Busso, also thanks to Elvira, who introduced him to me a few years before the presentation of his book. We got along very well. Many people, when they had to deal with him, thought he had a very difficult character. But in my memories, Well, he was a good person and very gentle. This was our meeting. I just wanted to thank you, Mr. Busso, for what you represented, for what you did, and for making big Alfa Romeo, the Alfa Romeo that we recall and we hope it can become in the future again. So I want to give you this gift. So this is for me? Yes, yes. A life of passion to director Giuseppe Busso. So these are just anecdotes, but this is just to say that the Alfa Romeo family is a beautiful family. And one of the merits goes to this person who was able to create the competitive but healthy environment for the Alfa Romeo workers. So the best designers, technicians, we see Orazio Satta here. Scarnati from the design department, Nicolis, Orazio Satta, Busso, Orazio Satta with Scarnati. These four great characters, Chiti, Luraghi, Busso, and Satta. But also the test pilots. Here we have the luck of having Luigi Croci, who was one of the most historical test drivers of Alfa Romeo. I would like you, in 30 seconds, to say why Sanesi called his daughter Marinella. Well, Sanesi, well, in the 53 edition of Mille Miglia, the last Mille Miglia, that the Alfa Romeo took part to officially in 53, well, he was first with 187 kilometers per hour average, going through villages where the car could hardly go through, because it's not like today they went through the houses, but in Salta Marinella, a part of the body of the car broke and he went off track. Santa Marinella, the province of Pescara. So he says that Santa Marinella saved him, and when he had a second daughter, he called her Marinella. That's a history of Sanesi. So I started August the 30th of 1950. I was 14 at the time. Now I'm 19. My heart is here. No, the body is here, but the head is in Udine. So I'm going to tell you something that no one knows. Probably some relatives of Mr. Busso know it. We always have to keep in mind that many words are spoken, but not enough, because thanks to the genius and genius idea of Mr. Busso, for 30 years, thousands of families could have lunch and dinner guaranteed, because these were all innovations. It was the first engine in the world, the 1900, with a light alloy. We say aluminum, but it was an alloy. Then he did the engine of Giulietta before the 60s. And also Guido Moroni, historical friend of Giuseppe Busso, is here in the famous staircase with the project of the Matta, another out of the ordinary car, maybe one of the reasons why Giuseppe Busso remained in the company. Here we see him during the presentation of the Alfetta, and here when he was already retired. There's a memory, a video of Guido Moroni, when during one of his events talked to the workers. It is always an emotion. I'm more used to listen than to talk. But it was very pleasant to see all those men working around cars. And we hardly talk about them. We always talk about the managers, but not enough about the workers. And being old and seeing these things and reminding of the past, well, I remember of all the designer, mechanics, all people who get in love with their work and also give suggestions. When the suggestions are valid, we accepted them because we were a family from the manager to the mechanics. Anyone could express their opinions, and if good, these were accepted. There were good moments, bad moments, but we were like a family. And this, well, makes me emotional to think about how these cars were built. And I wish that the same will be true for the future also, because this is a period in which cars, well, are all nice, but ours are nicer than the others. We have to continue like this, always, as in a family, and to express what we think. And when what we, if and when what we say is accepted, that's good. And we have the pleasure of having here also the son of Guido Moroni, Federico Moroni. Well, I just want to say a small anecdote. I don't know whether you will talk about the Matta, but the development of the career of my father, who in 1950 just arrived at the test drive, or is linked also to many random things. Giuseppe Busso had this idea, the project of the Matta, and the first idea was also developed by Sanesi, and then the choice went on my father, and Guido started to work with Busso. They did, as you saw before, the staircase at the Basilica of Assisi, the pictures with the colonel and the army. So, as you know, the Matta had to be a successful project, and then it was not a success. It's a beautiful car, but it didn't have a long history. So, afterwards, my father did other things, like, for example, Mr. Busso was in Milan, and we lived 100 meters from him. So I'm 10 years younger than Fiorenzo, but I often went to his home because I didn't have an older brother, and Fiorenzo was my older brother. So this friendship, when my father talks about the family, well, that was true also at the level of personal friendships. Of course, Mr. Busso was always the director. My father was a simple test expert, but it was very democratic at Alfa Romeo. So just like my father reminded, when someone worked, the difference between managers and workers and employees and test pilots, well, didn't exist. So this is something important. So it's important in Alfa Romeo to recall this love for the company, for the products that were produced. So everybody felt part of this big project that then would see the light. Thank you. Well, Federico was talking about the matta, but if we had to talk about the matta, we would have to devote an entire backstage only to the matta. You just have to know that the matta, well, the Campagnola would never see the matta. But having said so, why the 6 cylinders doesn't have a twin shaft? On June the 21st, 1967, a strange engine was starting to be tested. The 4 cylinders, SATA was criticized because I was only able to project a twin shaft engine as if it was a shame. So I was very angry. So the drawings of a mad engine arrived. But the most interesting part was the head, which was spherical with V valves and a single shaft. So, in short, it was the drawing of the head that would be used for the 6 cylinders, and the first tests were done in Paris by Bosch, waiting for the 6 cylinders to arrive in 1971. So we're talking about this. But here we have the son of Edo Mazzoni, who was, just like Erwin Lasberg, an arm. It defines him one of the best engineers. And the son of Edo Mazzoni, Marco Vinicio Mazzoni, who's there, I'm going to introduce him to you, send me an audio where you can listen to his father talk about this. 2 twin shafts, 1 per each series, so it was easy to command, but we also had to command the 3 exhaust valves. And seeing how did I get there? I got there through the same camshaft, commanding with 3 small glasses, 3 aspiration valves, 3 more cups side by side, controlling and tips to get to the other line of valves, and with a 90 degrees idler to control the valves. And this was the idea that then led to the architecture. It was not easy to realize it, but it led to this architecture of the combustion chamber, ideal for our performance programs. This was Edo Mazzoni. Marco Vinicio, can you come here? Thank you for your invitation. I grew up with Red and Alfa Romeo. My mother worked at Alfa Romeo, my father worked at Alfa Romeo, but at the time that was a very strong rule. We didn't talk about engines and cars in our house because it was an industrial secret, which was absolute. So I grew up in the middle of Alfa Romeo, but never hearing talking about engines because we were 10. But my father said, if the kids talk about themselves, it will be a mess. So it was extremely serious. So I only have memories about human facts, not technical facts. About the engine, I knew something from the interview done 3-4 years ago. So I recall small things on Busso, but the nicest one is this one, which gives a different side to the apparent strong person with a strong character, edgy character with Ferrari, there were fights probably because there were two roosters. And when Busso was in Ferrari, he stayed there for 1 year and a half, and then the two didn't get along very well. Then he came back to Alfa Romeo, but he became friend of the designer who took his place, a young engineer at Ferrari, very good, but who died young. And then Busso, being no longer at Ferrari for his entire life, since that guy was buried in Livorno, every time he went to Livorno, where Spica was based, it was a company which worked for Alfa Romeo, and Fiorenzo also worked there. Well, he went to the tomb of this guy. So this gives you an idea of the heart of this person who looks to be hard outside but was soft inside. And then another memory, a very, very far and distant one, of the fist spirit of Busso when in the 40s they were in Orta, so during the war. They were displaced. The Alfa Romeo designers, a team 7 or 8, names that I heard before, went on a bike tour, but the bikes were the bikes of the times, are broken, with parts taken from the trucks. So with these bikes, they went to the hills of Orta, but Busso had a race bike, a real one, a nice one, and nobody knew how. So they went together. Then he said, "Well, okay, I go," and he disappeared, leaving everybody behind. So my father always had a wonderful memory about him. He always talked about a great master. Busso and my father were like this. Thank you, Marco. If today we have cars which, as the commercials of Alfa Romeo said, it's a family car who also wins races, well, this is only due to this person. This is the last slide. I like it very much. It's a picture that was taken during the presentation of Giuseppe Busso's book here in Arese in the museum next to his Matta, one of the most beautiful cars that he ever designed. And thank you for your attention. Have a nice day.